Inside Parchman, the untold truth behind America's most controversial prison. For more than a century, one name has echoed through America's criminal justice history, a name whispered with fear, controversy, and questions that never seemed to fade. That name is Parchman. But behind the headlines, behind the federal investigations, behind the decades of public scrutiny, lies a deeper and far more complex truth, one shaped by documented reports, lived experiences, and the kind of institutional history that forces a nation to look at itself in the mirror. Today, we peel back everything the public thought it knew and uncover the real, verified story of one of America's most debated prisons. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Mississippi State Penitentiary, better known as Parchman Farm, is not just a prison. It is one of the oldest correctional institutions in the United States, and over the years, it has been the subject of Federal Department of Justice investigations, national news coverage by AP, NPR, and Clarion Ledger, extensive academic research on correctional environments, civil rights lawsuits spanning multiple decades. Yet despite all the attention, many people still don't understand how Parchman earned its reputation, or what the verified findings actually reveal about the institution's past and present. This documentary explores that truth through verifiable records, historical accounts, and psychological insights documented by experts like Craig Haney, John Irwin, the National Institute of Justice, and research from leading criminal justice institutions. No myths, no exaggeration, no graphic content, only the facts and the human reality behind them. The land where it all began. Parchman doesn't look like most prisons in America. Built in 1901 on thousands of acres of farmland in the Mississippi Delta, it was originally designed as a working plantation-style penitentiary, where incarcerated men labored in open fields under a system modeled after the old agricultural economy. Decades of investigative journalism and academic studies describe Parchman's early years as a place defined by strict discipline, hard labor, and an institutional culture shaped by the rural South. Historical reports show that the prison once operated almost like a self-sustaining farm, raising its own crops, maintaining livestock, and relying heavily on inmate labor to keep the entire system functioning. To understand how Parchman built its reputation, you have to understand its isolation. Surrounded by wide fields and distant tree lines, the prison was deliberately placed far from densely populated communities. This remoteness, documented in state records and research by justice scholars, created an environment where outside oversight was rare and internal culture became deeply rooted. Over the decades, conditions, policies, and public expectations changed. But the weight of Parchman's early structure, the fields, the remoteness, the work-oriented system, cast a long shadow that shaped the institution for generations. As federal investigations would later highlight, understanding Parchman's present requires understanding where it started, because the roots of its reputation began long before the modern era. The rise of a national controversy. By the late 20th century, Parchman had already become a subject of national conversation. But the turning point came when federal courts and civil rights advocates began examining the prison's operations more closely. In verified historical records, one case stands above the rest. Gates versus Collier, 1972, a landmark federal decision that declared several of Parchman's past disciplinary practices unconstitutional. The ruling was widely covered by national media and is still cited in criminal justice research today as a pivotal moment in the modernization of American corrections. For the first time, The nation saw Parchman not just as a remote institution in the Delta, but as a symbol of a much larger conversation about prison conditions across the United States. But even after that ruling, the controversies didn't end. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, journalists from outlets like AP News, NPR, and the Mississippi Clarion Ledger began publishing investigative reports highlighting ongoing challenges, ranging from infrastructure concerns to staffing shortages that affected daily operations. These were not rumors or unverified claims. They were documented findings supported by public records, state audits, and statements from corrections officials. Then came the involvement of the U.S. Department of Justice. In a significant move, the DOJ Civil Rights Division opened a formal investigation into several Mississippi correctional facilities, including Parchman. Their published report outlined numerous issues and recommendations, reinforcing the need for oversight, modernization, and institutional reform. For those living inside the institution during these years, the scrutiny brought a complicated mixture of hope, tension, and uncertainty. Experts like Dr. Craig Haney, whose research into prison psychology is widely published, explained that environments undergoing intense public and legal pressure often create a climate of instability, where incarcerated individuals and staff alike experience heightened stress and unpredictability. Inside Parchman, the environment reflected these pressures. Verified reports documented that each new investigation, each lawsuit, each published article added another layer of attention that forced administrators to confront long-standing structural challenges. And as more eyes turned toward Parchman, a new question emerged. Was this a moment of crisis or the beginning of transformation? Inside the pressure point, life under scrutiny. When a prison becomes the center of national attention, life inside changes in ways that aren't always visible to the outside world. But through the lens of documented research and first-hand accounts published by major news outlets, we can understand how pressure from federal investigations reshaped day-to-day existence inside Parchman. Verified reports show that during periods of intense oversight, staff shortages became one of the most critical challenges. Corrections officials publicly acknowledged that maintaining consistent staffing, especially in rural facilities, was difficult. This reality is echoed nationwide, but at Parchman, the effect was amplified by its size, age, and remote location. Experts from the National Institute of Justice have long noted that understaffing in any correctional environment increases stress, disrupts routines, and strains communication between officers and the incarcerated population. Inside Parchman, this tension contributed to a sense of unpredictability, an environment where daily structure could shift quickly depending on available personnel. Inmate accounts published in interviews and court records often described long stretches of uncertainty. Not graphic, not sensational, just the psychological weight of not knowing what each day would bring. Criminal justice scholars like John Irwin and Craig Haney emphasize that unpredictability is one of the most significant factors shaping inmate behavior and institutional culture. In environments with fluctuating routines, people inside often become hyper-aware, cautious, and tightly attuned to small changes. For many men incarcerated at Parchman during these years, the uncertainty forged a quiet kind of vigilance. Routine decisions, when to step out, when to speak, when to withdraw, became calculated choices meant to avoid conflict or misinterpretation. And yet, amid the tension, verified reports also documented moments of resilience. Educational programs, faith-based initiatives, and mentorship efforts continued to operate, giving some individuals a sense of direction in an environment where stability felt fragile. These pockets of structure, supported by organizations both inside and outside the walls, were often described as lifelines during periods of institutional strain. As pressure mounted externally, a deeper transformation was happening internally, one shaped by human behavior, environmental stress, and the universal need for some form of order. Parchman was not just under investigation. It was in the early stages of an identity shift, one that would force the institution to confront its past and redefine its future. The human cost of instability. Whenever a correctional facility enters a period of transition, the most powerful changes aren't always the structural ones. They're the psychological ones. Parchman, during its most scrutinized years, became a real-time case study of how institutional uncertainty affects the minds and behavior of the people living inside it. Research from the American Psychological Association, the Chicago Crime Lab, and scholars like Craig Haney shows a consistent pattern. In environments where routines shift and oversight increases, individuals experience heightened levels of alertness, stress, and self-preservation behaviors. These are not dramatic or sensational reactions. They're deeply human ones. Inside Parchman, verified accounts often describe a quiet, internal tension that built up slowly. Men learned to read the environment the way others read weather patterns. A slight change in the tone of an officer's voice, a delay in movement or schedule, a new policy or announcement reaching the units. All of it carried meaning. This hyper-awareness wasn't about fear, it was about adaptation. Studies from the NIJ confirm that in unpredictable environments, the brain shifts toward survival-focused processing, where people become more attuned to subtle cues and more cautious about every decision. Inmate memoirs, interviews, and court testimonies, those publicly available through verified news reporting, often describe the same internal strategy. Stay observant, stay neutral, stay contained. For some, this psychological adjustment became exhausting. For others, it transformed into a disciplined routine, an internal structure that replaced the external one that sometimes faltered during staffing shortages or institutional strain. But amid the tension, there were stories that stood out, stories documented by reporters from AP News and Clarion Ledger. Men who joined educational programs to keep their minds steady. Men who formed quiet mentorship groups to help younger inmates navigate institutional life. Men who relied on faith-based communities to maintain balance and clarity. These realities rarely make it into popular narratives about prisons, but they are essential to understanding the real story behind Parchman. That even in an environment shaped by controversy and federal scrutiny, human resilience found ways to surface. As the DOJ investigation deepened and the public's attention intensified, the institution entered a turning point, one that would trigger reforms, political debates, and nationwide conversations. And Parchman itself stood at the center of all of it, forced to confront not just how it operated, but what it wanted to become. When the nation turned its eyes to Parchman, there are moments in history when a story inside a prison becomes a story the entire country cannot ignore. For Parchman, that moment came when multiple crises, legal, structural, and administrative, collided at the same time. National media outlets, including AP News, NPR, and the Marshall Project, began publishing detailed investigations into Mississippi's prison system. These weren't brief reports. They were long-form, multi-part investigations based on interviews, public records, and official statements. And with every new headline, public pressure intensified. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division took a deeper step, announcing a sweeping investigation into several Mississippi prisons, including Parchman. Their findings, released publicly, outlined numerous issues ranging from staffing shortages to infrastructure concerns. The federal report didn't rely on rumor or speculation. It used documentation, policy analysis, and multiple on-site inspections. This national attention created a ripple effect. State officials held press conferences. Advocates organized. Correctional experts began discussing Parchman in academic panels and justice forums. Policy debates reached state legislature chambers. For people inside the prison, this sudden flood of attention had a very real impact. In verified accounts from interviews and court statements, inmates described a shift in the atmosphere, an awareness that something larger was happening beyond the walls. Some felt hope that conditions might improve. Others felt uncertainty, recognizing that large-scale reform often comes with unpredictable transitions. Correctional officers, too, were experiencing their own pressures. Public scrutiny highlighted the staffing issues they had long struggled with. Experts from the National Institute of Justice have consistently pointed out that correctional staff in under-resourced institutions face high stress, rapid burnout, and logistical challenges that affect their ability to maintain consistency. Inside Parchman, this was no different. Public attention brought calls for reform, but reform takes time that was felt deeply by those living and working inside the facility. Yet this heightened scrutiny did something important. It forced the state and nation to confront a decades-long conversation about incarceration, oversight, and the future of correctional institutions in America. The question was no longer whether Parchman needed change. The question became, how fast, how far, and how deeply could that change go? And as the pressure mounted, Mississippi found itself pushed toward one of the most significant periods of correctional reform in its history. The turning point: push for reform. Every institution reaches a moment when change is no longer optional, when pressure, scrutiny, and public accountability collide so intensely that reform becomes inevitable. For Parchman, that moment emerged as national attention intensified and documented investigations began shaping the narrative. When the Department of Justice released its findings, the report detailed structural and operational issues that required immediate attention. These findings were not allegations. They were the result of on-site inspections, policy reviews, and interviews with both staff and incarcerated individuals. The DOJ's documented recommendations emphasized improved staffing, enhanced oversight, and long-term investment in infrastructure. State officials could no longer ignore the weight of the national conversation. Mississippi leaders, corrections administrators, and lawmakers began discussing a roadmap for reform. Public statements acknowledged the challenges revealed by the investigations. Some reforms were already underway. Others required funding, planning, and long-term commitment. Verified reports from NPR, AP News, and the Clarion Ledger noted several key steps taken during this period. A push to recruit and retain more correctional staff. Increased collaboration with external oversight bodies. Plans for infrastructure upgrades. Policy adjustments aimed at improving internal operations. Greater transparency with the public. None of these changes happened overnight, but they represented a shift from decades of limited oversight to a future shaped by accountability. Inside Parchman, these reforms created a complex atmosphere. In verified accounts, some inmates saw the changes as a necessary step toward stability. Others viewed them with cautious optimism, aware that institutional transformation takes time and consistency. Correctional officers also felt the impact. With new staffing initiatives and support programs, the burden on existing personnel gradually started to ease. Experts from the National Institute of Justice have long emphasized that officer well-being is a crucial factor in maintaining safe and orderly facilities, and early reforms reflected this principle. The transformation wasn't only physical or administrative. It was cultural. Academics like John Irwin have written extensively about how prisons develop deep-rooted institutional identities. Changing that identity, especially in a place as historic as Parchman, requires sustained effort, leadership, and a commitment to modernization. What emerged from Mississippi's reform period was the start of a new chapter, one shaped not by silence or remoteness, but by public attention, policy action, and attempts to reshape an institution that had become a national symbol. But the journey was far from over, because reform doesn't erase history. It builds on it. And to understand how Parchman continued to evolve, we must look at the individuals who lived through this turning point, those whose experiences reflected the true cost and true potential of change. The path forward. Parchman is not just a prison. It is a reflection of history, policy, and human resilience. Decades of scrutiny forced change. Federal investigations exposed weaknesses. Reforms brought hope and structure. Inside, men adapted. Staff adapted. The institution adapted. Psychologists like Craig Haney remind us, stability comes slowly, through routine, oversight, and respect. Parchman's story is still unfolding. Its past shapes its present. Its present guides the future. The lessons are clear. Reform is possible. Human resilience is powerful. And the truth, documented, verified, and unflinching, matters. If you found this deep dive into Parchman insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Every week, we explore verified, eye-opening stories from America's prisons and justice system. Stay curious. Stay informed. The untold stories are waiting.